Welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue our discussion of evolution today. Last lecture, we talked about the people who influenced Darwin. So, we discussed Cuvier and Lyell and Buffon. And now we are going um, to talk a little bit more about Darwin and how he took all of those ideas and what he was doing that helped him develop his theory of evolution. And remember, when I say theory of evolution, I am using the word theory in the scientific sense. So, a theory in the scientific sense is a hypothesis that has been tested over and over and over in many ways, and it is continually supported. So, when we finish talking about all the different type modes of evolution, we are going to talk about all the evidence for it at the end of the lectures. And all of those pieces of evidence are different hypotheses that all fit together. And that is why this is a theory of evolution. So we finished talking about Lyell and how his ideas influenced Darwin. So now let's talk about Darwin. So in the 1830s, many of these ideas were floating around or had been published already, and Darwin embarked on a 5-year expedition on the Beagle, was the name of his ship that he went on, and he was hired as the naturalist on that ship. And he a library on board. So he probably reread it many times over that 5-year period. And you can see he started in London and they worked their way down, along the coast of South Africa. And then, South America, stopped in the Galapagos here. So this was right on the equator, an important spot. And then they made their way across the Pacific and stopped in some islands along the coast of Australia, up through Australia, and then around through the Horn of Africa. So this is a full around the world 5-year journey. And along the way, Darwin collected samples of things. And in that time, collecting samples is not just like picking up rocks, it's shooting animals and, doing taxidermy and bringing them back to be studied later. At all of his stops. And one of the important things that he did was in the Galapagos, he was able to collect many samples of finches from different islands. So the Galapagos are a small archipelago. There's not a lot of islands, not a lot of land mass, but they have 14 different species of finches. Which is many more than a much larger area in South America has. So that was a very interesting little tidbit for Darwin. Why do these small islands have so many species, whereas the mainland of South America, which is so big, has fewer of these finches? Um, and he also noticed everywhere he went that the fossils of the extinct animals that he was able to find were often very similar looking to the animals that were alive in that area. Clearly not the same, but similar, right? So it showed this like change, and he could see that what used to be here was different but similar to what's here now. So here's just an example of 4 of these species of finches from the Galapagos. And as you can see, their beak size really varies, right? So we have these number 1 here, has a really, really deep beak. And this would be used for like cracking big nuts, right? And then number 4 has a very, very slender beak, and maybe that's used for manipulating small seeds or catching little insects, right? So depending on the food sources, they have different beak sizes and shapes. Now, there's one other um, person who really influenced Darwin that we didn't cover earlier. And so we're going to talk about him here. And this is another reading that Darwin took along his journey. And this is from Thomas Malthus. And he wrote this essay on the principles of populations. And um, and he was really, hundreds of years before his time, um, in thinking that the human population was growing too fast. So he's like, way ahead of those people in the 1970s. And he said, the human population is growing exponentially, but all of our resources are not. And he was very concerned that we were going to run out of food and space. And he said, if this happens, there will be wars, and if that doesn't wipe everybody out, then there's going to be famine. And he was worried that all of humanity was going to die. And Darwin read this and he said, well, what if it's mostly true, but what if not everybody dies? What if some people survive this? And what if those people who survive it are not random, but they have something that enables them to survive this famine, right? Or these wars and disease, right? What if those people have something else? And this really helped him. So, Darwin's journey was in 1831. He returns in 1836, and he just kind of mulls over the ideas of evolution for many years. He writes down his ideas, he writes them to friends, and says, I'm thinking of these things, but he was really scared to publish. This was considered heretical at the time. It was against the church. He was a religious man. And he was really worried about the repercussions of coming out with this idea. So he just sat on it for a really long time, right? So he returned from his journey in 1836. In 1858, he got a letter from a young naturalist who is in Papua New Guinea, Alfred Russel Wallace, who you will see looks a whole lot in his old age, looks a lot like Darwin, who's here. Um, and Wallace was a young naturalist from England as well, living in Papua New Guinea, which is off the coast of near Australia in the Southeast Asia, and he was like, I'm looking at all of this evidence, and I read Thomas Malthus, and I have this crazy idea, but I'm kind of afraid to come out with it. What do you think? So he really just wanted Darwin's opinion. And Darwin realized, like, wow, someone else is coming up with the same idea that I am. And he spoke to friends about it. His friends then went to the Royal Society of London and presented both of their ideas. They said, these two gentlemen have both come up with this idea independently of natural selection, right? So nature is selecting who survives and who doesn't. Wallace actually was not pleased with this. He had said he wasn't ready to be published, right? He was just kind of sketching out ideas. Darwin was too nervous, but they were both presented on the same day. So they really should be getting joint credit when we hear about the theory of natural selection. But Darwin then, since he'd been kind of thinking things over for a really long time, the next year he published his book on the origin of species by natural selection. So he is often given credit because he was the first to publish, but they actually both came up with this idea independently. Okay, so now let's talk about this idea of evolution, right? That they came up with. And natural selection is actually not the only way that an organism can evolve. So we're going to go through all of the ways that evolution can occur. And before we do that, we really need to discuss the definition of evolution. And we did it in the very first lecture, and we're going to do it again now. Evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. Whoop, I did not mean to highlight everything there. So it is at the population level, right? So populations evolve. If the genes change from one generation to the next, that population has evolved. An individual cannot change their genes. So you really need to remember that evolution occurs at this population level. So anytime the percentages of an allele change in a population, that population is evolving. Okay, so let's have an example here and think about how evolution could occur. Let's say you run a tiger preserve and you have mostly orange tigers in your preserve, right? So here we have on the left your starting frequency of orange tigers, right? And you're at like 90% orange here, right? And like 10% white. So we just have this little bit of white. And you want to increase the percentage of white tigers in your population. I want you to think of ways you can do that. So just pause this for a second and think about ways to increase the number of whites. And maybe some of it you may not actually be managing it, but just think of how all of those things, how that could happen. Okay, I'm guessing that most people decided to breed only the white tigers. Am I right? So if you were a white tiger breeder, you just performed some selection, right? It's not natural selection. Nature is not deciding that only white tigers breed. It's not that they're fitter and survive better and get more food and are more attractive to other tigers, but you decided to breed the white tiger. So that's artificial selection. And absolutely, that selection is one type of evolution. But there are three other ways that don't involve any deciding who's breeding. Can you come up with any other ways? So pause again. All right. So some other ways that that you could have a population evolving, and I'm curious if anybody came up with these on their own. So please put in the chat if you do. You could bring in tigers, white tigers from another zoo, right? You could have some forced migration. So if you import white tigers, your allele frequencies have changed. So migration is a force of evolution, usually increasing genetic diversity. You could, by chance, the next generation, when they breed, you could end up with more white tigers. So if maybe these orange tigers are heterozygotes, right? And if assuming that this white um, tiger gene is a recessive, if when these heterozygotes breed, you could by chance get more white ones. That's possible. So that's the third way. This is called drift, genetic drift. Just by chance, allele frequencies change. It doesn't mean the white ones are fitter. It doesn't mean they were better. It's just by chance those alleles increase. And then the fourth way is by mutation, right? If one of these orange tigers has a mutation and their offspring are white, right? They're a mutation in the eggs or sperm. So these are the four mechanisms of evolution: mutation, genetic drift, migration, and finally natural selection. So we're going to go through all of these mechanisms, but I think we'll pause here and then we'll start up again.